Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Conservation Banking webinar series. We're going to get started with webinar number 4, the Operations and Management of Conservation Banks, the role of mitigation review teams and banking partners. Thank you all for joining. My name is Katie Allen. I'm with the Conservation Fund, and I'll be facilitating and leading our discussion today around several topics related to the operation and management of conservation banks. And we're thankful for all of you to join us today. Just wanted to touch on a few orientation elements as we go through today's webinar. You've all been muted for the duration of the presentations, but please use the chat box throughout all of the presentations, as well as when we get to time for question and answer, to put questions in the chat box, and make sure you select host or everyone so that we can gather those questions and ask those to our panelists. If we have time, I'll go ahead and unmute participants to ask questions if we have the time available to do so. If you are new to WebEx, be sure to select your preferred view for seeing everybody's presentations. During the discussion, grid view is recommended, and I'll show you where those controls are on the next slide. Closed captioning for today's program is provided in the link. There's a link in the chat box that will provide a live captioning of the audio if you need that service. A couple things in terms of orientation. Your video view menu is up on the top right side of your screen. When you hover over there, you'll see your several options to click on. Grid view highlighted here. Several other options include providing feedback at any time. You can find those here in your participant panel with the megaphone icon. And again, to access panels, those are mostly found at the bottom of your screen. Participants panels to see all participants and access those feedback tools, and the chat panel where you can ask questions directly to me as the host or to everyone. Again, everybody has been muted, and additional controls are found throughout your screen. So welcome again. We appreciate everybody's time here today. As I mentioned, I am with the Conservation Fund, where we are working to make conservation work for America by creating solutions that make environmental and economic sense. We do work in the mitigation field, supporting permitting responsible, voluntary mitigation, environmental stewardship programs, and in-lieu fee programs across the landscape. We are a national nonprofit organization, and through the work of the Conservation Leadership Network that I direct, we provide trainings and conservation-oriented solutions for on-the-ground groups to build capacity to do more on the landscape. As such, we are providing this conservation banking webinar series to all of you free of cost to a wide and diverse audience. Which all webinars are open for anyone that is interested to learn more about conservation and joint authority mitigation banking. This webinar series is based off of our National Conservation Banking Training course that provides foundational topics related to conservation banking. Throughout this series, we have presentations from field experts represented by the federal regulatory agencies, non-governmental organizations, and private banking community. So we're so thankful to have all of our speakers here today and those that have participated across the series. If you're interested in learning more about any of the topics that have been previously done or would like to refer to this topic as we close, all webinars have been recorded and will continue to be recorded and will be posted to our webinar website, along with each of the speakers' bios and contact information, as well as a whole list of resources that you can continue to access to further find more information about any of the topics discussed. The National Conservation Banking Training course is currently scheduled for September 27th through October 1st at the National Conservation Training Centers. And wanted to thank everybody that's been a part of bringing this webinar series to this audience. It is sponsored by the Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the Federal Highway Administration, with support from our planning partners at the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, National Marine Fisheries Service, and members of the Ecological Restoration Business Association. So big thanks to all of them as we continue to bring this 8-part webinar series to you all. So I wanted to plug for our next webinar that's actually going to come up next week, next Tuesday, December 8th, from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern. We will be talking about service area and credit determination really discussion on the considerations of balancing ecological and economic factors that can minimize banking risk. Think about how each of these features support conservation banking on the landscape. And we will provide a case studies ranging from the straightforward to the complicated, and along with lessons learned and best practices around these two subject topics, service area determination and credit determination. So without further ado, I do want to jump into today's program. Again, we're going to be talking about operation and management of conservation banks. So our previous webinars have set the stage to discuss what is conservation banking, what is the business of banking, and how do you select a site for a conservation bank. Now we're going to talk about the roles of mitigation review teams and their banking partners, and to talk about how each of those play in the role of instrument development, implementation, and managing a bank throughout all of the phases of its quote unquote life. There's going to be best practices shared from 3 of our panelists today, all of which are national instructors from our National Conservation Banking course. And I'll do a quick introduction of each. Charlotte Kuchera with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service serves as a Texas Transportation Liaison based in Austin, Texas. She'll be talking to the role of the mitigation review teams. Veronica Rowan is with the Department of Interior's Office of Solicitor for the Pacific Southwest region, and is one of few solicitors that advise on conservation banking program. And we'll be talking about documentation. And finally, Valerie Lane, who is with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Institute for Water Resources, is an ecologist at the Institute for Water Resources, but also serves as the national admin for the Ribbits database, who she'll be talking about some of the best practices of the management, and especially how Ribbits can play a critical role in management. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Charlotte.
All right, thanks, Katie. Pull up the presentation here. All right, hopefully you all can see that okay. Thanks for joining us today, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about operation and management of banks. And we'll go through these topics. We'll talk a little bit about mitigation review teams, which we refer to throughout the presentation as MRTs. We'll discuss our banking partners and what roles and responsibilities are included in conservation banks. We'll go through the process, documentation, and how to get banks approved, essentially, through the agencies. We'll talk a little bit about mitigation management and best practices that can be used. I'm going to start with mitigation review teams and banking partners. So we frequently describe both the biological and business benefits of establishing and using conservation banks for listed species. Among the biological benefits is the ability to aggregate both small and large mitigation parcels into larger habitat blocks that will aid in recovery of species. These blocks help to preserve ecosystems, contribute to science, and support community conservation strategies. Conservation banks are also critical in that they avoid time lags between when the impact occurs through the permitting process and when the mitigation site is fully functioning, and they're considered a form of advanced mitigation. That means that the site is already functioning at the time the credits are released. The durability of the site or the sites is ensured through real estate protection, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. And you can see just from the language that is used here that it's going to require multiple entities needed to support a conservation bank. So let's go through a few of the business benefits because they're also important. Conservation banks provide a streamlined permit process. They transfer the liability for success of the mitigation provided from the permittee to the bank sponsor. They can also reduce the agency compliance and monitoring time. That's part of that aggregation process where instead of looking at multiple sites, you would only need to look at compliance monitoring on the bank site. And they reduce the need for enforcement across multiple sites. Conservation banks also provide a source of revenue, importantly, to the bank sponsor and landowner, and they bring together the development environmental communities to find a solution that works for both parties. So again, if you look at words like transfer of liability and revenue, it's not just federal agencies that are involved in this process. So how does this all come together? It begins with the work of mitigation review teams. So mitigation review team is a general term. It encompasses different types of review teams that are described by federal agencies. The teams are typically chaired by regulatory agencies who oversee the development of mitigation and conservation banks or in lieu fee programs. These banks and programs are for the resources that are under that particular agency's jurisdiction. So for example, these could be endangered or threatened species listed under the Endangered Species Act for Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA fisheries. That could be wetlands or streams under the Clean Water Act for the Army Corps of Engineers, or they could be state listed species under the jurisdiction of a state wildlife agency. Mitigation review teams can be just the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA fisheries or the Army Corps of Engineers, but they can also include multiple federal, state, or local agencies. Any agency with something to contribute can be a member of the mitigation review team. And each mitigation review team agency acts under its own authorities, and they can sometimes overlap with each other. The overlap we most often see at the Fish and Wildlife Service is between state and federal wildlife agencies. So we're going to talk about roles in a moment, but keep in mind that project proponents, that is individuals or entities that are looking for permit, applicants also looking for a permit, and bank sponsors are not typically members of a mitigation review team. For the Fish and Wildlife Service, the term for this team that we would use is found in our 2003 banking guidance, and that term is Conservation Bank Review Team, or CBRT. The definition of a CBRT per our banking guidance is an interagency group of federal, state, tribal, and/or local regulatory and resource agency representatives that are signatories to a bank agreement and oversee the establishment, use, and operation of a conservation bank. For the Army Corps of Engineers, the term for the team is Interagency Review Team, or IRT. It's defined in the Army Corps of Engineers, EPA, that is Environmental Protection Agency, 2008 Compensatory Mitigation Rule, which oversees the development of wetland mitigation banks and in lieu fee programs. So the definition per the 2008 rule for the Corps and EPA is an interagency group of federal, tribal, state, and/or local regulatory and resource agency representatives that review documentation for and advise the district engineer on the establishment and management of a mitigation bank or an in lieu fee program. So you can see across the agencies, the definitions are very similar. There may be multiple interagency review teams or mitigation review teams, depending on how areas of responsibility are broken down by the regulatory agencies within your state or your region. For example, in Texas, where I work, there are 3 Fish and Wildlife Service offices, multiple sub-offices, and 4 Army Corps of Engineer districts. So what do they do, these review teams? When we talk about review teams and their work, they're really broken into 2 segments: before the bank is established and after the bank is established. So pre-bank establishment, that is when we are working to approve the agreement and get the pieces on the ground needed for the bank to be functional. The review team gives guidance to the bank sponsor about what information and documentation is needed to complete the approval process. They are likely to conduct a site visit to the potential bank property, or if there are multiple properties, to all of the sites. They also review document submittals, and they provide a recommendation regarding bank approval to their agency. So each MRT member, mitigation review team member, would be looking for offset for their own resources under their jurisdiction, and they would be speaking through their chain of command regarding approval. Post-bank establishment, that is after the bank is approved and it has begun to be operational, the team has oversight responsibilities for the bank. These responsibilities relate to the credits that are going to be used as offsets for impacts. and the agencies have approval authority over the release and use of those credits for the resources that they regulate. So in general terms, what this means is that the same agency who permits impacts to a particular resource would also regulate the use of any credits for that resource within the bank. If you've joined us for any of the previous presentations in this webinar series, I feel certain that you're familiar with the three-legged stool that supports any conservation bank. It's a pretty common slide that we use. So these are the foundational elements that support conservation bank credits. And those credits rely upon the ecology and land management that supports the credits, the real estate assurances that protect the site, and the financial assurances that provide a source of funding to implement needed actions on the site. There are several key roles for players in a conservation bank, and those roles support the legs of the stool. In practice, there can be many more roles than are listed here, but these are the primary roles. So we'll take a break from the slides for a minute and interact with a poll. So which group do you identify with for our audience? Based on the ones shown on the screen. The poll can be found, I think, on the right-hand side of your screen. Katie's going to deploy it. And although you may identify with more than one group, you can only choose one in this exercise. So we'll give folks a few minutes to choose which one of these best fits.
Folks are still putting their answers in.
And what you can see is that we've broken these roles down into governmental entities, private parties, nonprofit organizations, regulatory authorities, and project proponents. And we'll go through each of these separately after we're done with the poll.
So it looks like things are slowing down. We got about 86% of folks was able to provide an answer to the poll. Feel free to use the chat if you want, if you do not have access to the poll. But I'll go ahead and close the poll now, Charlotte, and show those results.
All right. So looks like we're pretty evenly split between governmental entities and regulatory authorities, but we do have some private partners and nonprofit organizations. Some project proponents who are with us, which is always good to see, and some folks that are not in any of these categories, but are interested in conservation banks. So that's fantastic. Thanks everybody for participating in that. So no surprise, these are the entities that are typically involved in conservation banks. So when we talk about banking partners, it takes most, if not all of these groups to enact a conservation bank. I'll make a few notes here. Note that we separated the federal agency roles between governmental entity and regulatory authority. So you could have federal agencies under both of those, but this makes it easier to illustrate who has oversight authority versus entities maybe at a state, county, or tribe level that might be interested in being a bank sponsor. A couple other things that you may not be familiar with on this slide. Joint powers authority, which is found under governmental entity. That's a partnership or collaboration between similar agencies across separate local or state governments. They're usually formed to help manage common goals or problems that cross local and state borders. So for example, one might be formed to manage a large transit project that connects numerous urban areas. And another term you might not be familiar with under nonprofit organization is congressionally chartered foundation. So again, an organization that was set up by Congress. An example of that would be National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So just a few terms that are a little bit outside of the norm there. So we'll look at each of these entities and the role that they usually play in conservation banking. We'll look at them one by one. So keep in mind here that while other connections may be possible, these are the recommended roles through the conservation banking lens. So for a private party, that would be an individual, a corporation, or a limited liability company. The typical roles that they would play are bank sponsor, land manager, and/or landowner. The same private entity may simultaneously play the role of bank sponsor, land manager, and landowner for a given bank. That is, they could assume all of those roles. Some bank sponsors prefer to own the land that they wish to create a conservation bank on. Others enter into an agreement with a landowner who retains ownership of the property. So it depends upon the model that the banker may be using. For a nonprofit organization, which could be a conservation organization, a land trust, a community foundation, or a congressionally chartered foundation, it could take on any of the roles that you see above. So they could be potentially the bank sponsor, the land manager, the landowner, the conservation easement holder, the endowment manager, or the long-term steward. However, if they play one role, it may exclude them from the same entity from playing another role on the same bank. So for example, a bank sponsor cannot also be the conservation easement holder for any given bank. And the role that nonprofit organizations most commonly fulfill in Fish and Wildlife Service conservation banks is that they are the conservation easement holder. So that would be a typical role for a nonprofit organization. For a governmental entity, in this case, that would be a city, a county, a tribe, could be a special district, a state agency, a federal agency in a non-regulatory role. Remember, the federal agencies in a regulatory role are going to be under compliance typically, or a joint powers authority. They could be the bank sponsor, the land manager, the landowner, or the long-term steward. Legal, procedural, and ethical considerations often constrain the ability of most governmental entities when it involves holding easements and endowments. So that's why you see that there are no lines between governmental entity and those roles. So those roles would only occur to a governmental entity under limited circumstances, and they would be approved on a case-by-case basis. For the regulatory authority that is overseeing the credits that are being sought in the bank, they typically only have one role, and that is oversight and compliance responsibility for those credits. They create the record in the agency tracking system, which is RIBITS, that is the Regulatory In Lieu Fee Bank Information Tracking System. And Valerie will talk a little bit about that later on. They approve credit releases, and they discuss any compliance issues or adaptive management with the bank sponsor and the easement holder. And finally, we get to the project proponent role, and we have some of these folks with us this afternoon. So the most common role for a project proponent, which could be an individual, an entity, or an agency, is creating the need for credits. That is, they are the group that is looking for offsets related to a permit or a biological opinion. However, they may also operate a bank for their own use. When a project proponent sets up a bank for their own use, this is referred to as a single client bank. And for a single client bank, the project proponent then would have the same roles as a private party. So this is a replica of the first slide that you saw with roles. That is, they could be the bank sponsor, the land manager, and/or the landowner. So we'll go through just a few of the operational responsibilities. So under operation of the bank, remember the bank is open and available to sell credits. And this is what each of these roles would be responsible for. So during bank operation, the responsibilities of the bank sponsor include being the primary point of contact under the banking agreement or the bank enabling instrument. They are responsible for access to the property along with the landowner if they do not own the property, managing the property to meet ecological performance standards. Those are the underpinnings, the biological underpinnings for the credits. Working to secure credit release. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Marketing and selling those credits. Funding the financial assurances that help to complete the on-the-ground management. Requesting the funds for that management from the endowment holder. completing the annual report to the mitigation review team or the interagency review team, and maintaining the bank in rivets, which is the tracking system that federal agencies use. Under this operation, the conservation easement holder is responsible for annual monitoring of the easement terms, and that includes the allowed and prohibited activities on the bank parcel that are found in the conservation easement. They produce an annual conservation easement report to the mitigation review team and the bank sponsor. They communicate with the landowner and the bank sponsor and can engage in compliance discussions if needed. They're responsible for the legal defense of the conservation easement document, and they may re-record the conservation easement as needed with the landowner and the bank sponsor. Some states have conservation easements that are of a set duration, and they have to be re-recorded periodically. The land manager is responsible under the operation portion of the bank for on-site management and maintenance of the bank. They're working to meet those ecological performance standards, and they are managing the bank according to the land management plan. The land management plan is divided into tasks with appropriate costing, and that can include tasks such as vegetation management and monitoring, species monitoring, prescribed fire on the landscape if needed as part of that management and monitoring section. There may be grazing that has to occur, or there may be grazing that needs to be managed. And there can be bank stabilization in terms of stream banks. They're also responsible for maintaining a relationship with the neighbors to the bank property. They monitor the bank for issues such as trespass or invasive species. They're going to request funding for the annual management, provide information for the annual report. They're going to identify if adaptive management is needed. That is, if something's not working and needs corrective action, they're going to identify what that is, why it's not working, and what a possible alternative would be. And they can adjust management for geographic constraints. That is, oftentimes there could be burn bans, and so prescribed fire is not appropriate. They may need to adjust that management due to proximity to infrastructure or other issues that may arise during the life of the bank. The endowment holder is going to hold and invest the endowment principal prudently and according to applicable federal and state laws. They are going to make timely disbursements of funds and as described in the endowment funding and management agreement. They're going to report to the mitigation review team, the bank sponsor, the property owner, and land manager. So they are going to be responsible for the funding and disbursement of those funds. And finally, the regulator or the mitigation review team, they're going to monitor all the aspects of the bank oversight and compliance. They will review and approve credit releases. Those are tied to ecological performance standards. They will review the annual reports received from the bank sponsor, manage the bank agreement, including site visits as necessary, complete that adaptive management working with the bank sponsor and the easement holder and the land manager. They'll set up and maintain the bank in the tracking system, rivets, and they'll address issues of noncompliance. And with that, I'll turn it over to Veronica.
Thank you, Charlotte. For the benefit of all of you, I'm getting a very strange lighting effect, so I am actually going to stop my video, and before I share my screen, and I will share my screen. Okay. So thanks, Charlotte. That was a great overview, and I'm going to move on to this process and documents section. Now that we know something about the folks that are involved in the bank, this section basically tells you how the bank is going to be established. So I just wanted to bring us back for a little context and show you where the Fish and Wildlife Service is. Basically, they're everywhere in the United States. One of the things that I wanted to point out was I know this box right here is not very legible. That is the Pacific and Hawaiian Islands. That is part of region, well, what we think is region 1 of the Fish and Wildlife Service. and Alaska is its own region, and Puerto Rico, I believe, is part of Region 4. And the reason that I wanted to bring that up is because I wanted to show you where the banks kind of exist on the landscape currently. So as you can see, there's a lot of banks in California here, and there's quite a few banks in Florida, but they're pretty much scattered all over the United States. And so there's going to be regional differences in the processing of these banks. One of the things that I wanted to note was that in California, the reason that you see a lot of banks in California is because California's been at it for a pretty long time. Probably a little over 25 years ago, I think the Fish and Wildlife Service started to follow the lead of the California Department of Fish and Game, now known as the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and to some extent the Army Corps of Engineers in establishing some of these banks use this compensatory mitigation for impacts that were taking place for endangered species. Let's go on. Well, how does the Fish and Wildlife Service think about banks? Well, as I noted, the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA also, they implement the Endangered Species Act. And so one of the things that I wanted to just note was that they note they are under Section 7 and Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act. And so there are impacts that occur in the implementation of both of these sections of the ESA. And so when the Fish and Wildlife Service approves a conservation bank, it's looking at it with the recognition that the adverse effects to the species would be offset by these banks. So implicit in the approval of a conservation bank is the recognition that the adverse effects to a species may be offset by the conservation improvements offered by the bank. And so what that means is that the service is agreeing that projects which include adequate mitigation of impacts through the purchase of bank credits are consistent with the conservation needs of the species. So let's look at what the steps are for bank establishment. Typically, we'd like to see all of these steps happen. Early coordination being one of the things that is generally optional. This is more just an overview of how the process flows. Just one note here in the second bullet point, we generally like to call this portion of the proposal in the 2008 mitigation rule from the Army Corps of Engineers. That's actually the prospectus. So this process is actually analogous to what you would find in the 2008 mitigation rule. So in the early coordination portion, like I said, it's optional but recommended. This gives the bank sponsor an opportunity to get the agency input on the interest for sinking a whole lot of money into the project. It's an opportunity for the bank sponsor to assess the market for credits and the agency for interest and the exchange of ideas for whatever potential mitigation needs would be in a particular area. Like I said, this stage is actually considered optional, but it is really kind of intended to assist the bank sponsors, whether they are novice bank sponsors or they're actually experienced bank sponsors, to decide whether to move forward with a project. One of the things that is also part of the early coordination could be a submittal of a draft proposal, which is actually a really good idea to bring forward to the review team, because it gives the review team a much better idea of what this could look like on the ground. And so in a draft proposal, we would like to see these these elements. Basically, this is going to help determine whether this bird can fly or not. Some of the important elements here are the site selection considerations. One of the important elements here is the site selection consideration. Primarily the ownership of the property. What kind of potential encumbrances exist, and if you were with us in our last webinar 3, we discussed site selection and site protection mechanisms, and it tends to play a very big part in citing a conservation bank and whether a conservation bank can actually be established in a particular area. Another one of the important things to look at is the the site. What is the site currently doing? Like, what is the current use of the site, and what are the surrounding areas? What does it look like? Is it connected to other conservation areas, or perhaps state or federally owned lands that are designated for conservation? What potential what's the potential credits going to look like? What are the type of credits that could be released under potential bank here? How many? How big is the site? How many acres do you think that this particular site can support? I mean, how many credits can this site support? The proposed service area, where the area in which these credits will be sold to offset impacts. And so if you get past this sort of beginning hump, the services say, or the agencies would say, that this could be a potential. You have potential here for this project. You're going to go on to the next stage, which is the proposal stage, which is actually required by the agencies. And this is the actual written documentation of some of the materials and some of the elements that you saw in the previous slide. So it's like, the property descriptions and identification of the property owner and the land manager, and there's a lot of detail that goes into this because it eventually becomes part of the entire bank package. One of the things that I like to say is that the service has discretion here to reject this proposal, and an accepted proposal does not guarantee an approved instrument. It's important to note that the agencies and the review team will always have discretion up until the time a bank is established to determine whether a bank document will actually get signed. So as I was alluding to before, the proposal contents includes, the development plan if there is one, obviously if the species is on site and what the biological baseline is. The phase 1 environmental site assessment, discussion of whether or not there are recognized environmental conditions, which means there may have been some sort hazardous materials deposited on the site. Obviously what the service area, sponsor qualifications. Have they done this before? Do they understand all of the ins and outs of this particular, of managing a bank, of operating a bank? The identification of the proposed easement and endowment holders, it's very important at this point to understand who might be the easement and endowment holders. The service and the agencies want to see what their qualifications are and whether or not these entities will be acceptable. I think Charlotte discussed the nonprofit organizations, and that's generally what we end up seeing that are the proposed easement and endowment holders. There's a lot of information, and there's questions that the agencies will ask, and they could ask for more information pretty much at any time. And one of the things that they review for is whether or not the submittal is complete. At the time the review team is looking at the proposal, there's a lot of questions. So there's usually sort of a continual submittal of information until all the questions have been answered and everything is clearly explained. And again, I note that the agency has discretion to reject a proposal at this time. It may not be appropriate for some reason or another, but part of the potential deal breakers at this stage could be title issues. The owner is not really the owner. The owner has other owners that are listed on the deed. Perhaps the other owners are not wanting to put a bank here. The phase 1 environmental assessment shows that there's a recognized environmental condition on the property where there was, like I said, a hazardous substance or a petroleum product on or in the vicinity of the property that may preclude the use of this land for this particular project, this particular mitigation project. Another thing would be species are not on site. Generally speaking, the Fish and Wildlife Services conservation banks start off with species on site, and they're generally the service generally looks for improvement of that condition in the management. A lot of the Fish and Wildlife Service conservation banks are preservation banks, which means that they're preserving the on-site condition, and it will take active management to preserve that on-site condition and improve that condition in the long term. Another one of the deal breakers is that there's delinquent property taxes. That's a title issue that would need to get resolved before a bank would become established. So now you move over to the instrument development portion, and this is where you're going to spend most of your time, because there's going to be a lot of negotiation and back and forth between the bank sponsor and the review team. For the most part, we like to see that the sponsors would utilize available. One of I think across there are templates available across the different regions of the Fish and Wildlife Service. They are going to vary in complexity. The California template, it tends to be a little bit more complex because there are 8 different state and federal agencies that are involved in that, and I'll show you an example of that later on. And then, of course, there's going to be multiple drafts that are going to be going back and forth and circulating throughout the agencies during their review. And generally, there is a solicitor's office review, but that depends on the region. The agencies, if it's just more than the Fish and Wildlife Service, say it's a joint bank with the Army Corps of Engineers or with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's many banks in California where the Fish and Wildlife Service is partnered with California Department of Fish and Wildlife Service and those kinds of joint banks. So there's those members of the review team from those other agencies. We're going to all be reviewing this concurrently. So we've talked about the bank enabling instrument, but what is it? So, I mean, that's what I have here on the screen, that first bullet point. It's the document that memorializes the agreement. And it also describes the bank operations. And it's a very important document, and it's very important to have clarity in the document because this thing is going to live on for a long time. So we want to be able to understand what the terms are and what it all means when it gets put together. The BEI comes as and I call it the BEI for simplicity purposes, but we call them CBEI or MBEI, Conservation Bank Enabling Agreement, or Mitigation Bank Enabling Agreement. Some people still call it a Conservation Banking Agreement, but for the most part, this is describing the same document. They also are used for in lieu fee programs, but I'm not going to get into any kind of in lieu fee program specifics. That I think is going to be covered in another webinar later in this series. So what are the typical provisions that go into a bank enabling agreement? Well, it's kind of, like I said, it can be pretty complex, but, for the most part, you're going to find most of this in any bank enabling agreement. You're going to have the parties, obviously. Next, generally the sponsor, the property owner, and the agencies signing the bank enabling agreement. The definitions, this is probably one of the most important sections in the BEI because it defines all of the terms. So everybody understands what the words mean, or at least we hope that's the result. The bank establishment date, it's when the bank is established. Generally, that happens when the site protection documents are signed and recorded in the county that the property is located. But there could be other milestones for establishment. The other things I wanted to note was the credit release schedule. Charlotte had alluded to credit release earlier, and Valerie will discuss it later on in this presentation. But basically, this particular the credit release schedule in the BEI describes the criteria that has to be met for the credits to be released to the bank sponsor so he can sell them. Responsibilities, this can differ, and these are property owner and the bank sponsor and also the agencies, and the responsibilities can differ depending on whether the bank is open or closed. So there's usually some discussion in the BEI of what the responsibilities are when the bank is operating and when it's closed, which means that all the anticipated credits have been sold. Bank closure, what criteria needs to be met for the bank to actually close? And normally there is an approval process that happens within the agencies when a bank sponsor requests that the bank closes. It doesn't close automatically. There's generally some provision in the BEI that discusses what needs to take place and what kind of criteria needs to be met. For example, the endowment should be fully funded. Obviously, all the credits are sold out, but there are other things that could be needed as and needed to be met for the bank to close, depending on what the agencies think they need and what the bank sponsor agrees to in the BEI for a particular bank. It varies. Like I said, in this particular stage, there's a lot of discussion between the bank sponsor and the review team. Like I said, these documents go back and forth. One of the reasons that we prefer the template approach is because they've already been reviewed and cleared by management and the legal departments of the agencies. Any changes to templates generally prompt an additional review, especially by legal, and sometimes sometimes the provisions of a template may not apply to a particular bank. So there could be. We're not saying that they can never be changed. We're saying that they could be changed. we just need to look at those. And it does slow up the review process and the approval process. So I mentioned earlier, and I think I said an earlier slide, and I apologize if I didn't say it. The BEI package generally involves the BEI itself, the agreement portion, and then all of the different exhibits to the BEI. And this is going to be all of the stuff that could have been previously prevented, or there could be some additional materials that get attached to the bank enabling agreement. And it all becomes part of this package that describes the bank and its operations and what's expected, etc. So just a couple of things I just wanted to point out. Well, first of all, I have to, these are all things that are based on the California model. I just wanted to just note that because maybe some of these items may or may not be necessary in some of the other regions, but I'm guessing that all of these things are pretty typical. Of course, you want to know where everything is, where the bank is, what the service area is, that's where the map is, where the credits can be accepted for the impacts. The credit evaluation, it's the biological and rational basis for the amount of credits that are in the bank. I think there's the next webinar next week discusses credit determination. This may be unfamiliar to you, but the property assessment and warranty. And that's basically a statement by the property owner of the condition of the property and the encumbrances that are recognized, the recognized encumbrances. It's a disclosure document by the property owner that talks about every encumbrance and particular, how can I put this? And a particular element that could relate to the property. It's basically an affidavit of condition by the property owner. Endowment documents. I know we haven't talked really about that. The funding for the long-term management and perhaps a trust agreement or however the endowment is going to operate and be funded. Obviously, the conservation easement is one of the most important documents that gets attached to the BEI. That's the site protection mechanism, and we discussed that back in webinar 3. And one of the other things that I wanted just to point out is something called a subordination agreement. And this is generally required when you have encumbrances on the property that you don't want to take priority to the conservation easement that is going to be recorded later in time. If you saw the last webinar, we kind of talked about this a little bit, and what the subordination agreement does is it creates the condition where the conservation easement that will be recorded for the mitigation bank, it creates the condition where that is the priority encumbrance and everything else is basically subordinated to that. And so if what it does is it prevents folks from coming in, like say there's a mortgage on the property, and we like to have that mortgage subordinated to the conservation easement. So if in fact for some reason the mortgage company has to foreclose on the property because the mortgage wasn't paid, that means that they can't just extinguish the conservation easement. Because that conservation easement is there for the long term. We expect it to be there for the long term mitigation of those impacts that happened on the other side. So you see, we get to the final instrument, and you see why we spend a lot of time in those other stages, because there's a lot of discussion that happens, and these documents are fairly elaborate, and there needs to be an understanding of how this bank will operate, who's who in the zoo, basically, who the roles are, who's playing each role, and when those roles mean something. So the final agreement is pretty simple. I mean, it's once you get down to the actual agreement that you're going to sign, basically it gets signed. It gets signed by the agencies that are going to be releasing credits for impacts to resources under their jurisdiction. So as I go back to the first few slides that we talked about, when you have an impact under the Endangered Species Act, for example, and an HCP, let's say under Section 10, those impacts need to be mitigated. They can be mitigated by buying credits in the conservation bank. And so that Fish and Wildlife Service would obviously sign that conservation bank document, because they're releasing those credits. They're saying those credits can be used for mitigation of these impacts. Obviously, the property owner and the bank sponsor, sometimes they're the same entity, sometimes they're different. And it's a building process. So once you get to this, stage, you've built this agreement, you've built the package that will become this conservation bank. So I just wanted to show what this looks like, what a bank enabling agreement instrument looks like in real life. So this is the California. This is a screenshot of the table of contents for the California template, the most recently approved template from 2017. We are updating it. There's going to be a new template coming out next year. As you can see, there's a lot of detailed information on how the bank operates, and other things required as the responsibilities of the bank sponsor, the funding information. It's a fairly complex document, and I wanted to, again, stress that this is based on this is the California document. There are 8 different federal and state agencies that are involved and that use this document. So it's gone through a lot of different review and a lot of legal review. And one of the reasons that we like to see it used without many changes is because we don't really want to take it through the legal review again, because it just slows the processing of the bank. So let me just talk about what the review process for the service actually kind of looks like. And it varies by region. The next few slides are just the differences, the examples of the regional differences in the services approval process. So here we have Region 1, where all of these banks start out at the field office level. So you have a general review that's happening for the agency review team member from the Fish and Wildlife Service at the field office, and then it goes through regional office review. Here, the solicitor's office gets involved and the assistant regional director, but eventually it gets signed by the field supervisor of that, wherever that particular bank is located. It's located in the territorial jurisdiction of that field office. Here we have the Region 2, 3, 5 approval process. I imagine this is looks a little less complicated. It still always starts out at the field, and it looks like the solicitor and the regional office get to take a crack at it. And this signatory is actually the assistant regional director for these regions, for these particular banks. And 4 and 8, which is California is Region 8 and Florida is Region 4. And I think if there were two regions that have been at this the longest. It's these two regions. It's mostly the field office that pulls the weight here. The solicitor's office reviews it if there are changes, and the field supervisor is the signatory. And so some important milestones for establishment. Basically, a bank is established, once an instrument is signed. Mostly, I've seen the actual establishment date of a bank be when the real estate protection is granted and recorded, where I said the conservation easement is signed and recorded in the county that the property is located in the records. When the short-term securities are funded, these are the interim securities that are there for the protection of the bank and the bank sponsor, just in case things go wrong, or if there's development or establishment happening on the land, if there needs to be some construction or something. Generally, this is something that's that the Corps has when they're approving mitigation banks. There's a construction or a restoration element to the wetland banks, but there's always a short-term security that's funded, and it usually lives out until the endowment is established, or until the endowment is fully funded. Excuse me. And there's always interim management that happens until the endowment is fully funded, until the bank goes into long-term management. And so just some final thoughts. Early coordination is something that we'd like to see. It helps us understand when folks are thinking about this. It helps us give input into a particular proposal that a potential sponsor is coming to show us. It can really help the bank sponsor in a way where they don't have to expend a lot of time or resources. And if the agencies don't think that it's a proposal that they would be able to approve in the long term. Please refer to the available guidance. Current guidance for conservation banks for the Fish and Wildlife Service is the 2003 guidance for the establishment and operation of conservation banks. That is something you can find on the Fish and Wildlife Service website. One thing that I didn't emphasize in the earlier is the site visits. You have to really go and look at the site. I mean, before you can actually approve something, you need to look at it. I think aerial photographs and on-the-ground photographs only can go so far, but if you walk the property, you can really understand how this is all supposed to work. It's good to identify the conservation easement holder and endowment holder early in the process, so we don't have any hiccups there. There's usually, sometimes there can be disagreements about who can hold these different the different elements of the conservation bank, the conservation easement, or the endowment. I think I've said this before. We generally like to see accredited nonprofits, and that's Land Trust Alliance Commission accredited entities. It actually helps the process along because bank sponsors don't need to worry about having to do more due diligence with regard to their the conservation easement holders and their endowment holders. Obviously, pay attention to the details. We want to make sure that everybody understands the terms of the bank enabling agreement. It's important that that people can pick up the document years down the road and understand what everything meant, what it all means, how this operates. And so we don't want to leave anything ambiguous or vague, because, 10 years, 15 years down the road, there could be a situation where the people that were involved in establishing the bank, both on the review team, are long retired, and then they have to pick up a bank document and go, oh, I don't understand what that means. What does that mean? So we want to make sure that all of that is defined and well understood. And of course, agency involvement on the operation of the bank depends on the resources that we have. And so one of the reasons that we have conservation easement holders and endowment holders and long-term managers is to do the reporting to the agencies. And so our oversight is an efficient use of our time. Let's put it that way. And with that, I'll turn it over to Valerie.
Thanks, Veronica and Charlotte. And let's see, I guess it looks like I can share now, so we'll get started. Okay, whoops. Sorry, we need to start on slide 1. There we go. So I'll be talking about the last 2 bullets. Hang on, there's a box in the way here. There, okay. I'll be talking about the last 2 bullets on this slide, the mitigation management and best practices. Now, some of you may have seen this graphic before. This is the relative timeline of the stages in the life of a bank. And as you've heard, there is a lot of work involved in the early stages of setting up a bank. And if this is done properly, then the later stages are a lot easier. And what I'll be talking about right now is mostly going to be in that light blue box. These are activities that take place or things that need to be addressed throughout the life of a bank. And that's after the instrument is approved and the bank is established. There's still a lot to do, as you can see from the number of things in this list. I'll address the items that, oops. It's all of a sudden, oh, there we go. I thought I was frozen for a sec there. I'll address the items that are underlined on this list. And these are the ones that typically take place during the operation phase of a bank. So if you're not familiar with credit releases, what they are is oops. Okay. Sorry. I got lost in my notes. After a bank is approved and it's ready to start operating, the number one thing the bank sponsor needs is a credit release, the first credit release. And so if you're not familiar with that, what that is permission to make a specific number of credits available for sale or for use as an offset. Now, later webinar is going to talk about how you arrive at that number in the first place. But right now we're talking about a bank that is already open for business. Some banks have had all of their credits released at once, but this is becoming more rare. Those credits in those banks are for preserved habitat, usually, where they're not building or planting anything, they're just preserving and managing habitat. They don't have any ecological performance standards to meet because they didn't construct or restore any habitat. It's now typical for banks, even banks that offer preservation only, to have a credit release schedule, which means the bank needs to meet milestones before having credits released. I have a couple of examples here for you. These are from actual banks. The one on the left is, or these are actually conservation banks. The one on the left is for a preservation bank, and the one on the right is for a bank with constructed habitat that needs to meet ecological performance standards. Typically, a credit release schedule spans about 5 or 6 years if there are ecological performance standards that need to be met, but that time can be shorter for preservation-only banks, and can also stretch out for a much longer period depending on the circumstances. So on the left, what you see in the preservation bank, the credit releases are all tied to, except for the first one. The first one is just the, the first one here is just execution of the instrument. So that's their bank establishment, was just executing the instrument, and then they got 15% of their credits. And then the next one, they had to start funding their long-term stewardship fund principal. And that was the criteria for the rest of the credit releases, was funding the long-term stewardship fund principal. And for the bank that has constructed habitat, their first credit release is a little more complicated. Their bank establishment release included a few more things. And let's see, approval of the instrument, and then recorded conservation easement, and then evidence of a performance security, which is one of the securities that Veronica was talking about earlier. And then the next releases here down in release 3, you finally get to the ecological performance standards, where they have to meet the year 2 standard for vertical invertebrates and the year 2 standard for the hydrology and vegetation. And these are all explained in the instrument, or they should be very well described in the instrument, so they're very clear and everyone understands what the requirements are. So credit releases are not automatic. The bank sponsor requests a credit release and provides documentation for how the performance standards have been met. The regulatory agencies then review the documentation and determine the actual amount of credits that are going to be released. The criteria for credit releases is specified in the instrument, often in one of the attachments or one of the exhibits, as Veronica was talking about. And documentation of the credit release should be uploaded into RIBITS, which is the regulatory agency's database for mitigation and conservation banking. Oops. Amendments and modifications to bank instruments are actually pretty common. You might think that a newly approved bank instrument is perfect, but at some point it's likely that there will be a need to change something. And there is a process for this, and it can take a significant amount of time and negotiation. And I saw a question in the chat about this, and basically about the process, asking about what the process is. And the process, whatever it is, should be determined by the MRT, and it should be in the instrument. If the core is part of the MRT or IRT, then they have a process that's in regulation for doing this, but the other agencies don't. So the process, whatever it is, should be in the instrument. But if it's not, then you'll just have to, basically the process would be the bank sponsor, if the bank sponsor wants to request a change, they submit that documentation to the MRT, and the MRT reviews it. And then there's a back and forth negotiation often. Some modifications can take a while. They're for, let's say, umbrella bank sites, adding an umbrella site to a bank. It's basically when an existing bank, the sponsor would like to add another site that's not contiguous with their original site, and they can do that under the existing instrument, and it becomes an umbrella bank. But that doesn't mean it's easier to do than setting up a whole new bank, because they still have to have the same amount of documentation for that new site as they had to have for their original site. But this is just another tool that is available. And so anything like adding a site or expanding the bank or adding a new credit type, those come with a lot of documentation. So they can take a little bit longer than other things like down in this list over here under streamlined process, where these things may not take as long and don't need as much documentation. And then other changes that MRT should be aware of, and bank sponsors too, that happen are change in sponsor and change in landowner. The very last one here, the change in landowner, that's starting to happen more and more. as banks are aging and property owners are selling properties and or leaving property to their heirs. There are new landowners that are taking on these, and it's important to make sure that they understand what it is they need to do. Banks also require reporting of some kind, and there can be multiple reporting requirements. Now I'm going to give you a best practice here. If you're a bank sponsor or a consultant preparing documents, or if you're a regulator reviewing those documents, it's a good idea to make sure that all reporting requirements are summarized in one place in the instrument. It's pretty common for instruments to have reporting requirements spread throughout multiple documents with conflicting information, as in due dates. I have seen this happen often, and that can lead to compliance issues later on because things start to fall through the cracks. So it's a really good idea to have it all in one place. This is a recommended list of reporting requirements that should be included in instruments, and there may be others depending on the situation. Basically, anything needed to demonstrate compliance with instrument terms or performance standards should be included. Also, annual maintenance and adaptive management, anything that was done over a period of time, if it's an annual report, annual maintenance and adaptive management, things that arise. Credit release requests can be made through annual reports. They can also be separate. Credit ledgers should always be included. And reports on the long-term stewardship funding account. What's the status of it? Is it fully funded? How is it doing? What's the balance? And the financial assurance report, whether or not any of those securities that Veronica was mentioning earlier, if any of those have been used, or if they're still in place, or if they've been released to the bank sponsor. Now, RIBITS is the Regulatory In-Lieu Fee and Bank Information Tracking System. And I know many of you are probably familiar with this already. It was developed by the Corps to track wetland mitigation banks and in-lieu fee programs. And the federal agencies whose logos you see over here on the right corner, top right corner, have partnered with the Corps to further develop RIBITS and to include their banking and ILF programs. And actually, a lot of the agencies often work together on the same banks. As Charlotte mentioned earlier, there are several joint authority banks. RIBITS is a public-facing website, and much of the information it contains is available to the public, and the URL is right here. That's the address where you would go to find it. Now, bank records are created and maintained by the regulatory project managers. Bank sponsors have limited access to upload files and create withdrawal transactions in the ledgers, but they can't do anything else. Oops. My mouse got stuck there for a sec. Okay, the agencies can use RIBITS to track the location and distribution of banks, conservation banks, and service areas, and credit transactions and documents. And there's a number of geospatial tools in RIBITS. Let me get rid of this. Let's see if I can get rid of this. Okay. Oops, sorry about that. Okay. And the map on the left is what you see is you saw that nice map that Veronica showed you of the distribution of banks across the country. This is what it looks like in RIBITS. And the green circles are open banks that are open and selling credits, and the red ones are banks that are sold out. And this over here is a service area map. And if you're, I think Veronica was explaining this. It's a geographic area in which a bank's credits can be used as an offset. Now, this is very important to bank sponsors because it determines where they can market and sell their credits. And potential purchasers of credits can search in RIBITS to find which banks have a service area that intersects their project location. And regulators do that as well. Now, bank documents are stored in the cyber repository. The regulatory project managers maintain the files, and bank sponsors may upload documents, but they cannot delete or edit any information. And this is a good place to share files between bank sponsors and MRT members. MRT members can be given access to the documents, and bank sponsors can upload submittals here instead of using email, which I always found to be really useful. There is no limit on file size. However, if you have an extremely large file, then it may time out, but there is no limit on the file size that can be uploaded. This is also a good place to store documentation of credit releases and other correspondence. The documents can be made visible to the public. The documents in the list that you see here on the left are all final documents that are publicly viewable, but drafts are usually not made publicly viewable. And it's up to the regulatory project managers to maintain this and delete any old files that are no longer needed, or old documents or files that aren't needed anymore. One of the most important things documented in RIBIS are credit ledgers. Each bank has a ledger and a ledger summary. The ledgers document the date, the permittee, the permit or file number, how many credits of each kind were sold, and what the credits were used or sold for. So let me grab that pointer again. And okay, transaction date, here's the permittee, and the permit, under permit, that's kind of a generic term in RIBIS. This column right here, this is all Fish and Wildlife Service file numbers. These are not permits, but these are file numbers, and there is a biological opinion associated with some of these. And here are the credit classifications: California red-legged frog. And here are the number of credits that were sold in the transaction. And you can see that the number of credits has a one-to-one relationship with the number of acres in the bank. And then here in the comments field, this is what the credits were used for, the project that the credits were used for. The paperclip on the left here means that there is a document associated with this withdrawal transaction. And if we click on that, if you clicked on that little paperclip, can't do that because this is just a PowerPoint, not a live link. If we clicked on that paperclip, then the document would pop up on the screen. And in this case, the document is actually the biological opinion that goes with this impact project. The ledger summary below here shows the number of possible credits that the bank could have. That's right, that's called potential credits right here. If they meet all their performance standards, this bank can have 46.77 credits. And there's three types of transactions in this ledger: initiation, release, and withdrawal. And the initiation transaction, that's the one that starts the credit. That's the pot of credits right here that they might possibly get if they meet their performance standards. So we have to, that's what you start with. You have to start somewhere. So then moving leftward, we have released credits. These are credits that have met some kind of milestone, and so they've had this many credits released. And if we go up here into the ledger, you can see under release, there's 7 credits were released, which is 15% of the total based on bank establishment right here. That's signature on the instrument and recording the conservation easement. And then there's another release on top of that one. They had documentation provided of funding, the target amount, the long-term stewardship fund, target amount at 40%. And then the withdrawn credits, there's been this is the total number of credits that have been withdrawn from the bank. And this is the number of credits that are currently available for sale, the 1.646. And so you can see they haven't had all of their credits released yet. Let's see. Bank sponsors can be given access to create the withdrawal transactions in their banks. They cannot create any other type of transaction or release credits. And in fact, they have a time limit. Once they begin entering a withdrawal transaction, they have 1 hour to complete it. And then they contact, and after that hour is up, they can no longer edit the transaction. If they make a mistake and they can't edit it, then they need to contact the regulatory project manager and let them know that something needs to be corrected. That doesn't happen very often. Now, the Find Credits tool is the tool I was mentioning earlier, where this allows regulators and potential purchasers of credits to find which banks have a service area that covers an impact project site. And this example shows a search for banks with available golden cheek warbler credits. And we we selected golden cheek warbler credits from here. We selected a point on the map, which is that point right there. And then we searched and found, Ribbits found 3 banks that have a service area that covers that project site. And these 3 banks have credits available. And Ribbits also has a pretty robust reporting functions. In fact, we're always adding reports. You should take a look at that. And the graphs and charts are kind of a new feature. And the ones I have shown here are for all banks combined wetland and species nationwide. But you can run these for banks in the smaller geographic areas, such as field offices or core districts. And this is just the number of withdrawal transactions. This is not the number of credits withdrawn. It's the number of transactions that have taken place. This is how many times all banks combined have sold credits since 1995. And it's got some interesting trends here. And this one is for bank approvals over time. All banks combined again. This is an internal feature. The calendar is an internal feature. It's not available to the public, but it's a great project management feature, I find. Regulatory bank managers can schedule meetings and site visits, due dates, or other things in the calendar. And Ribbits will send out email reminders to a list that's determined by the bank manager. And that can include MRT members, bank sponsor, and consultants preparing documents. And here you see these are not real banks, these are training records, but here's what an IRT meeting looks like on the calendar, and here's what a monitoring report due date looks like. The due date reminders can be really important if regulators and bank sponsors have multiple projects with different due dates. And these have prompted bank sponsors to communicate with the agencies regarding discrepancies in due dates or extensions if they feel they need more time to prepare a report. Now, I mentioned the discrepancies in due dates maybe a couple slides ago. And they have used this to communicate with agencies prior to it becoming a compliance issue. After a bank is completely sold out of credits, they may close. And Veronica was talking about this earlier. This marks the point where a bank moves into the long-term stewardship stage of its life. And many bank sponsors would like to turn over the long-term stewardship to another entity. This is not automatic, however. This slide is showing a list of typical criteria that must be met. It may be different for different banks. The bank sponsor requests closure from the MRT and includes documentation of how they have met the criteria. The MRT reviews the documentation and responds. The criteria should definitely be described in the instrument. This whole process should definitely be described clearly in the instrument. Sorry, my mouse keeps slipping here. So what does it mean to be out of compliance? Now, part of a regulator's job in managing conservation bank projects is documenting compliance and ensuring that a bank is on track. Bank sponsors are required to do all of the things in this list, and failure to do so becomes a compliance issue that then needs to be corrected. And these are all things that I've seen fall through the cracks. I don't think bank sponsors intentionally go out of compliance, but things happen and some things do fall through the cracks, especially when instruments aren't written clearly. So what compliance tools are available to the regulatory agencies? Well, whatever they are, they should all be written into the instrument and thoroughly described. And there are a number of tools, as you can see from this list. There's a number of tools available for open banks. Credit releases, I'm going to point this one out especially, credit releases in the second bullet here, are an opportunity to check in with the bank to make sure that everything is on track. That's a great tool. A lot of the things on the list on the previous slide, a lot of these things on this list here can be framed as performance standards and tied to credit releases. So these two, performance standard and credit release, the top two bullets are the really important ones here. Well, they're all important, but they're key. A decrease in available credits, that's usually a temporary measure where usually it is employed when a bank is not meeting performance standards for whatever reason, and the MRT and the bank sponsor agree that they will reduce the number of available credits until something is fixed. This has happened a couple times that I'm aware of, the bank sponsor and the MRT will agree, this part of the site is just not going to work. It's not working, it's not going to perform, and we need to just write it off. If it's not feasible to replace it somewhere else, we can write this part of it off and just decrease the number of credits that the bank can sell for that credit type. And that has worked. Suspension is normally temporary, and you can suspend either the credits or the operations of the entire bank. It's like I said, this should not be a permanent thing. And as far as I know, there's only been 2 conservation banks that have been suspended. And let's see, mobilization of financial assurances. That's something Veronica alluded to earlier, when these financial assurances that have been put up to make sure that to protect the bank sponsor and the MRT to reduce the risk of something going wrong. Those can be mobilized if something needs to be fixed on a site. And then terminate the instrument, the very last bullet there under open banks. That one is, I consider that the nuclear option. And that's a last resort. Nobody ever wants to do that. In fact, nobody ever wants to suspend credits or even decrease available credits, but sometimes things happen. But in terminated instrument, nobody ever wants to do that. And I'm only aware of 1 conservation bank ever having been terminated. And there's a couple hundred conservation banks in existence. So for closed banks, well, there aren't as many, for closed banks, there's no more credits to sell, the performance standards have been met, so there are fewer things that can go wrong. So there are fewer tools needed. And the conservation easement is the main tool, and that one has been talked about, in previous discussions. And the agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries, and often the Corps, are named as third-party beneficiaries on these conservation easements, so that they can enforce the terms of the easements if they need to do so. If the grantee or the holder of that easement doesn't want to enforce or is not able to enforce it, but an enforcement action needs to happen, then the agencies can step in and do it. And again, I'm not aware of any conservation banks where this has been an issue, where it's needed the agencies have had to step in to enforce an easement. And then the instrument, as Veronica was talking about earlier, the instrument can also contain provisions for what happens in a closed bank and what tools might be used to correct some issues. So the best approach to not only compliance, but to overall management of conservation banks is really a proactive approach, or really to any banks. It's a proactive approach. The requirements should be made clear so that everybody knows what to expect. And the second one, I can't emphasize this enough. Everything that's a requirement during the operation stage can become a performance standard and can be tied to credit releases. That's such a really proactive way to avoid compliance issues, because the things that I've seen most commonly with regard to compliance issues are those reports not getting submitted because the due dates were confusing, or somebody forgot, or they were just busy. And and also and long-term stewardship funding just wasn't happening. So it's really an easy thing to do is to tie these to the performance standards, and then they won't be issues later on. And also using all the features in Ribbit. It really is it's not just a database where you put credit transactions. It's really can be a very powerful project management tool and document storage. I've lost so many documents and emails that I don't even want to count how many that could be. And also, I know some regulatory agencies who have their emails expire. They just get deleted after they're automatically deleted by their system after a certain number of weeks. So if they're sent a document in an email and they don't get to it, if they're away for some period of time and they don't get to all of their emails, they will just disappear if they're not read and saved. So it's just a great tool to fall back on. And that's all for me. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Valerie.
Stop sharing.
Thank you so much to Veronica as well and Charlotte. At this point, we do have time for the remainder of our webinar to take some questions and put them towards our panelists. And I already have a handful there. So folks, if you want to put yourself in grid view, we've got our panelists ready to take some questions. So feel free to use the chat box or question and answer to ask some questions. So I did get kind of questions for all of you. So I'm going to start with what I have and then come back around to what's being put into the chat box. But one question to Charlotte, going back to the roles. So I have a couple questions about roles, but I wanted to say in your HAT example, can you walk through the transfer of liability between those potentially from the proponent and to the banker and then to the long-term steward, just to clarify that?
Yeah, we can do that. So the transfer of liability is really something that's set up in the bank enabling instrument. So it is that separate document that indicates between the regulatory agency and the bank sponsor that the bank sponsor is going to take responsibility for completing the mitigation according to the performance standards and manage the bank appropriately. That's really what the credits reflect. And so that bank enabling instrument indicates that the purchase of credits and the purchase of credit documentation, which we didn't talk too much about, but it's included, that is actually the transfer for that mitigation. So when the project proponent purchases the credits from the bank sponsor, the document used to do that will transfer the liability for the mitigation they require with, of course, the regulatory agency's approval to that bank sponsor. And so that's how that works. And all of the other components then are also built into the bank enabling instrument.
Excellent. So one more question on roles. One of our participants noted that in the hats, we love the hats, that tribes were not identified as an entity that can be a conservation easement holder. But overall, in general, I think that a tribal entity can have a lot of different roles. And I was wondering if Charlotte and Veronica, you can chime in here, and Valerie as well, to talk through a little bit of each of the potential for a tribal entity, but specifically, can they hold a conservation easement as one just question, but then there's also additional potential for how a tribal entity could play a role.
Yeah, so I'll just start and invite Veronica and Valerie to jump in. The answer to the question whether they can hold a conservation easement is yes, certainly tribes can hold a conservation easement. And we have examples of banks that tribes have an interest in, whether they're the bank sponsor or they may be holding the conservation easement, and you can take a look at those in Rivets. I think there may be some in the west of the country, and I think Oklahoma also has a lot of interested tribes, and so we may have some examples there as well. They could hold multiple roles, Katie, you're exactly right. So they might be interested in a single entity bank, for example. They might be interested in being a conservation easement holder. They could be a long-term steward potentially. So there may be multiple roles for tribes to play.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add outside, just other than to say that, I think it all depends on who plays an individual role, is how the bank is set up. It's who's involved in the bank, and how, what role they want or intend to play. It's all about structure, right? So who's who, and what do they intend to do?
Right, exactly. I think one of those key takeaways from Charlotte's hats segment was that even though it's possible to wear multiple hats at any time, if you do take on a certain role, it limits your ability to take on another role, because whether it's a conflict of interest or an oversight issue where you won't be able to, the regulator won't be able to differentiate your roles, then that's when we're going to start to have problems. And it'll probably be legal issues and ownership issues and all sorts of things that will be potentially a deal breaker at the onset of a bank. So exactly, Veronica, I think looking at those roles is going to determine the structure of this bank, and keeping that in mind. So the hats will be a great reference when you get there. So appreciate the question on that. So, but a lot of great tribal examples out there. Invite folks to seek out to see how engaging with the tribes on the landscape for multiple reasons, including cultural resources and ancestral hunting grounds and access. These types of things are folded into these instruments. So I think we talked a little bit about it in our site protection session our last webinar, but invite folks to discuss more on that topic as they are interested to. I have, and yes, we did get a chat from Steve Martin just to say that tribes can be a sponsor for commercial banks. And so one example is the Illumination Bank in Washington. And I think there's a couple articles that folks can check out for that. So I wanted to kind of pivot to a legalese question towards Veronica, and you did a great job to talk through all of the documentation things that are in that enabling instrument, and wanted to just, is it a federal action as defined in NEPA and the Endangered Species Act? Does it have that teeth, and who owns it? This is it's a big, complicated question, but there's some ramifications to it.
Okay, so I guess the best way that I can explain this is that it's always been a question, but the service has always interpreted it as not being subject to NEPA, because the credits, when they are proposed as mitigation for an impact, they are generally analyzed in the NEPA documents and also the ESA, the Endangered Species Act compliance documents for a particular project. So, and one of the things I think, the reason that the Fish and Wildlife Service interprets it this way specifically for NEPA is because there's really not any sort of on the ground change that happens. So there's really no environmental impact per se. So I think that's one of the reasons that the Fish and Wildlife Service has always interpreted that it would not necessarily be subject to any NEPA compliance. Or it's not a federal action.
Veronica, Valerie or Charlotte, anything from your experience if this has come up?
Not for me. Veronica covered it really well.
I think the Corps has also taken this stance. Valerie, do you have a different opinion on that?
Yeah, the Corps prepares a record of decision and a NEPA document for bank approvals. They write a permit for bank approvals as well.
Is it mostly because the wetland banks, some type of construction element to it or a restoration element to it that that the Corps does that?
I think it's because they write a permit for every bank. Most
Okay.
banks do have construction. I think rarely they, some have preservation, but that's kind of rare. But yeah, they do write a permit for every bank approval, and they consider that a federal action. And so that's why they do it. They prepare a NEPA document.
So that would answer actually a question for me as to why the service interprets it this way. It's because they don't actually write any sort of a permit for a bank, and most of the banks, at least for since the inception of the conservation banking program years ago, have probably been preservation. I don't know how many banks there are that are service-only banks where there would be some sort of restoration component to it.
Mm-hmm. There are giant garbage tank banks, but many of the banks that the service has signed on to are joint banks with the Corps. And so then the Corps has prepared the NEPA document.
Okay.
And there's construction involved.
Highlighting, and Steve Martin, retired with the Corps, has put a couple comments to panelists, but I just wanted to reiterate for all of the, for all attendees, we're getting quite a bit of traction on this, but an example is to look at Sierra Club versus St. John's Water Management District. The judge remanded the matter back to the Corps to complete a NEPA documentation for a proposed reduction in bank area. So that might get to Veronica, some of your thoughts on this, and a couple of other things to say that bank decisions came up during discussions of whether or not to prepare NEPA documentation. So this kind of has been going either elevated to courts for judgment or an ongoing part of the process at the district level at the Corps. We did get a kind of follow-up question on this, and maybe to Charlotte, does the same reasoning flow for ESA Section 7 during that consultation?
With regard to, I'm assuming we're talking
NEPA.
about with regard to NEPA. So, yeah. I mean, when we're doing a Section 7 consultation, it involves another federal agency or a federal agency approval. So the service does not do NEPA on Section 7 consultations, right? That would be the other federal agency that's involved. And according to our 2003 banking guidance, which has a discussion of this issue, the project for which the credits will be used is how the NEPA is covered. And that's what Veronica explained earlier.
Great. So just kind of transitioning a little bit, we did get a couple of questions around credit release, and maybe Valerie, you can chime on these just to go back and maybe clarify and reiterate a couple of things that you already said. And one of them was related to preservation only. So I think you mentioned that the credit release schedule could be not as complicated, maybe a little bit simplified based on of what needs to do. So just to clarify, if the endowment is paid in full at the closing of the bank and and maybe the recording of the easement, can all the credits be released at that point, or is it sort of case by case?
If they don't have performance standards of any kind, if they've fully funded their long-term stewardship fund up front and they don't have any ecological performance standards to meet, they can get their credits released right away. But we don't usually see that happen very much. We're more and more often seeing those long-term stewardship funds being funded over time. That doesn't mean the bank goes into, the bank is still going into its operational phase. It's not in long-term management yet. They can't use those funds to manage the site, but they might get their credits released up front if they've met all the requirements.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we did get a kind of another clarifying question just to talk about in general, how does a bank release potential credits? Could you maybe quickly just do a connection between what an ecological performance standard is measuring and how that relates to credit release. And then you did talk about those administrative elements like funding the endowment. Maybe just step back a little bit and talk about those ecological performance standards for a minute.
Oh, like what are they? So I think if I recall that credit release schedule that I showed earlier, there was a performance standard for vernal pool invertebrates, and then there was a performance standard for mention, and then there was mention of a performance standard for hydrology and vegetation. So in year 2, right? So these were a point in time at year 2, that bank would have to have a certain number of, this was a vernal pool bank. So it would have to have a certain number of vernal pools, would have to have the vernal pool invertebrates in its specific, the listed vernal pool invertebrates. And then they would have to have hydrology, whatever the hydrology standard is, it's usually inundation for a specific amount of time, specific period of time. And then a vegetation requirement where they had, for vernal pools, it would be no more than a certain percentage of cover, vegetative cover, and also the vegetative or the composition of the vegetation would have to be a certain native species versus invasive species. And that if they met that standard, then they would get a certain percentage of their credits. And then they but they'd also not only have to meet that, but then they'd also have to fund their long-term stewardship fund to a certain percentage to get that same credit release. And then maybe they had to submit a monitoring report also. And so there can be a list of things that's required for a credit release. Does that help answer the question?
I think so. I think so. For me, I can check in with Jordan, who asked the question. Yeah, and so I think going back to your slides about the credit release schedule, all banks would have something similar to that, depending on the species or the resource that it's directly related to. And those ecological performance standards, those administrative standards, and the long-term funding standards are those elements that need to be, addressed incrementally. And it's sort of at the discretion and kind of conversation between the MRT and the bank sponsor as to how that schedule might look like. So definitely ask everybody, if you haven't been familiar with Ribbits, to check that out. I assume Valerie, that's a good place for folks that can look at instruments to find those credit release schedules.
Yeah, and if you need help, just let me know, or you can also contact the Ribbits help desk, and they're very helpful and responsive.
Speaking of Ribbits, wanted to ask a question about, and this might just be a helpful question for all. One is that Ribbits include single entity banks, so that I know that they do, but one specific question was, is there in Ribbits any of those banks kind of related to HCPs, where potentially it's the county that's getting credits and combined to themselves?
Yeah, if you look in Ribbits and you search on if you filter on the Carlsbad Fish and Wildlife Office in California, virtually all those conservation banks are related to an HCP. They're all HCP preserves. And there are some banks can also have provided credits for HCPs, usually often low effect HCPs. And even in, I think, Texas, is that correct, Charlotte? HCPs sometimes purchase credits from banks?
They do sometimes purchase credits from banks. I will say we also have HCPs that have chosen to do permittee responsible mitigation. And so those, their internal preserve system set up under the Section 10 document, that would not be the same as a bank. And so that would not be included in Ribbits.
Great. Let's see, we've got some questions here. I wanted to, before kind of moving on to any, we did have a question about this, but wanted to plug webinar 6 will be on long-term stewardship and funding. And in that conversation, we'll be talking about land trust accreditation. Veronica mentioned this at the end of her her presentation that a key takeaway is to start to identify those conservation easements and long-term steward partners up front. And we'll be talking about that on webinar 6 and talking through, who is the Land Trust Accreditation Commission, why are those standards in place for land trusts, and how that also relates to this long-term stewards taking on this type of compensatory mitigation into the long term. So plug for webinar 6 coming up, I believe in January or the end of December. I have to get my schedule right. So one question about sort of that long term, and it kind of, I guess, relates to roles too as well. But if it's a preservation bank which has no construction requirement, does that require a performance security or any of those financial assurances?
It really depends on the situation. You might want a performance security, or the regulatory agencies might want a performance security if there are, or a security, if there are things like fences that need to be installed, or if there's cattle grazing as part of the management, one of the management tools, maybe they need to install some troughs or pumps or things for water pumps to feed the troughs, and things like that. And also if you have there have been some, I'm thinking about a California tiger salamander banks that were for preserving habitat for California tiger salamanders. Sorry, my battery's running low. It says I forgot to plug it in. So I'll talk really fast and then plug in my computer. And some of those had performance standard requirements when it wasn't clear how the salamanders were doing on the site. And they just didn't have the right information, but they had done so many surveys over time that we didn't want to stop the bank approval process. And we thought the site was good, but we wanted to hold back on credit releases, and we wanted them to put up a performance security until we were sure that the site was really good for tiger salamanders. Now I'm going to go plug in my computer.
Thank you. Well, thank you. And we're just at time, so I want to do a quick wrap up. And again, we're going to talk about that long-term stewardship and funding and the roles and responsibilities of management in webinar number 6. But at this point, I want to thank Valerie, Veronica, Charlotte for your presentations today on the roles of mitigation review teams, the documentation associated with the Conservation Bank, as well as the management and compliance needs for the full life of a bank. Just to provide a little bit of next steps and where we'll be on our next event. Save the date for webinar number 5, service area and credit determination, balancing ecological and environmental factors. So we will again be through our final webinar series talking about some nuts and bolts of banking. We're going to talk about these 2 very critical elements of a bank and the bank establishment process, and that is determining what are the service areas and what are the credit, how you determine those credits. And today we talked about a little bit of that, and especially how that relates to credit release. So we'll talk about how are the number of credits determined for a bank, and talk about some case studies, again, from the straightforward to the complicated. And we've got a whole host of presenters representing the regulatory agencies, some research from USGS, as well as our federal partners at BLM and bankers joining us for that discussion. So once again, thank you to all of our sponsors for this program. Want to thank the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Department of Agricultural and Federal Highway Administration, as well as the partnership from the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the National Marine Fisheries Service, including as well as our members at the Ecological Restoration Business Association. So thank you all for tuning in. Save the date for next Tuesday to join us for webinar number 5. And when this session closes, we ask you to fill out just a quick survey about the webinar. But again, thank you for your participation. We'll see you on our next webinar.